trained both in biology and in the history and philosophy of science. Campos's scholarship brings together archival discoveries with contemporary work at the intersection of biology and society. I think he's going to tell us a lot more about himself than, in a lot more intimate way than a CV actually does. So I'm going to leave that to him to do that. But I do want to say that one of the things that it says here is that his students get delight from the fact when he appeared on specials on the Travel Channel, the Discovery Channel, and PBS. He received his bachelor's in biology from Harvard University, his master of philosophy in the history and philosophy of science from Cambridge University, and his PhD in the history of science from Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Luis Campos.
All right, thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here tonight with all of you, the future of American science. We are not alone. Several months ago, when I was invited to address you here tonight, I wondered what sort of interesting news would be in the scientific headlines this week. There were lots of possible futures that I thought we might be living in today, but I never would have thought that I'd be standing here and commenting on one of the most remarkable discoveries ever made. That just last week, it was announced that we had found not one, but 7 Earth-sized planets in a solar system far beyond our own. 7 planets orbiting a single dwarf star, only about 39 light years from here, or about 229 trillion miles. The worlds out there just defied expectations. We've been hearing a lot about fake news recently, but this is real news. Amazingly real. When I started in college in 1995, we had just discovered our first exoplanet, and now we have over 3,500 of them. Most of them are totally unlike Earth, and so it's not every day that we get to talk about the discovery of a potential second Earth. Are there other planets out there in the universe like us? Well, it depends exactly what you mean by like us, but the general working hypothesis is yes. And what's even more exciting about this discovery is that of the 7 Earth-sized planets that we've discovered, 3 of these planets are in what we call the habitable zone. They might have liquid water. And that means that there might be living things there. There might be a second or a third tree of life out there. We live in amazing times. My name is Luis, and as you've heard, I'm the NASA Astrobiology Chair at the Library of Congress, that beautiful building just across from the Supreme Court on Capitol Hill. It's really a beautiful place, a people's palace, and it's dedicated to knowledge in all of its forms. And I invite you all to come and visit. I'm also the Secretary of the History of Science Society, which is basically, you might say, the AAAS for historians of science. And as a historian of science, I study how astrobiologists over the past century have talked about the origin of life, or the prospect of finding life elsewhere in space, and their ideas about the future of life in the universe. You can see an example here. So sometimes I have to work hard to explain what that means. And I'm not sure exactly what it is that my family thinks I do, but it's probably something like this. Or maybe astrobiology is this, they wonder. And I think some of my students at the University of New Mexico, before they take one of my classes, probably think that I do something like this. So even New Mexicans want to know about aliens in Roswell. But what I actually do every day is think about life. So here's my reenactment of that. Is there life on Mars? We know that there's ice there. Could we find life on Jupiter's moon, Europa, in the liquid water ocean that's under dozens of miles of ice? Or on Enceladus, another moon of Saturn? Or maybe on Titan, Saturn's largest moon with its methane atmosphere, where it rains down hydrocarbons into liquid methane seas? What would life look like there if it existed? Now, since I'm a historian of science, I also think in ways that go beyond the usual focus of practicing scientists. I look to link scientific work in a given field with the larger culture of its time, with the flow of history, with important philosophical issues, and with constantly changing but always relevant social contexts that are inextricable parts of how science is done and what it means. How astronomy and microbe hunting came to be associated with each other in the first place, and how the ways we think about astrobiology are intimately connected with how we think about ourselves and with the longer traditions of thinkers and artists and others who have grappled with questions of the heavens, of new worlds and of other worlds, of vast distances and of vast amounts of time. And even with what it means to be human, as a scientist living at a certain time and place, living on this pale blue dot of Earth, as Carl Sagan called it, suspended in the cosmos, floating in a sea of billions and billions of stars. We are not alone. We are connected to all living things around us, both ecologically and evolutionarily. So far as we know, there's only one tree of life for all living things on Earth, and we've done lots of work to try and identify that last universal common ancestor, or LUCA, our best reconstruction of a primeval living thing in the hot dilute soup of the early Earth. And if you want proof that chance circumstances can sometimes lead to remarkable things, take a look at my email address. The coincidental result of the IT department at the library doing some genome editing on my name here. So I just have to say, for a historian of astrobiology, that's the coolest email address ever. So if you're looking for Luca, I'm right here. So while we may not be able to fully reconstruct our ancestral origins in the distant past, we do know that we are not alone, even in our own bodies. The more we learn, the more we realize that our very health often depends on maintaining good relations between the 37.2 trillion or so cells in our body and the perhaps triple as many bacterial cells that live on, in, and with us. And we are colonized by these bacteria from our earliest days. Each of us has never been alone. Here are my last personal common ancestors. My father, born and raised in Mexico City, took a trip with some friends through Central America in the late 1960s and happened to meet my mother on a bus in Guatemala. My mother, who was born and raised as a farm girl in Wisconsin, was volunteering in the Peace Corps after having just graduated from an all-women's college. They were both the first in their families to go to college, and I owe them many debts of gratitude, and most recently for all their hard work uncovering the old and embarrassing pictures that you're about to see. My first terrestrial encounters with life on this planet began in 1976. All systems functioning, my grandfather declared on the day when he first observed that my diaper needed to be changed. I learned about gravity and equal and opposite reactions. And I had entered into a world in which I was never alone. And I demonstrated different scientific tendencies fairly early on. Dissection and comparative anatomy, early science communication, elementary astrophysics that could fit on a t-shirt, the slippery nature of time, camouflage and mimicry, kinematics, pendulum studies, as well as the intangible qualities of allowing yourself to be inspired, and of course, persistence in the face of obstacles. I began to practice public speaking, to my sister's annoyance, during her birthday party. And I inadvertently experimented on her pet gerbil. I wanted to help it to get some exercise by rolling around outside on the sidewalk in its plastic ball. It was a hot July day, and when I got distracted, I went back inside. I learned about habitability and life and death that day. I tried and mostly failed to master another exercise in spherical dynamics. I tried out civil engineering, and then finally advanced kinematics. And along the way, I devoured the zoo books that came every week, each focused on a different group of animals, and I tried to memorize their Latin names. I did a little better at that than I did at the cello. I wasn't much of an artist, but I was definitely a budding forensic scientist. Inspired by a book that I read, I fingerprinted my family, and I recorded their age, their height, their weight, and other data on index cards that I then filed away. I read the encyclopedia, I learned how to program in Logo on some of the first personal computers like the Apple II Plus, I learned about pi, and I taught my cousins about the solar system. I grew up in the city on the south side of Milwaukee, and we couldn't really see many stars from my house, but space was my thing. I was fascinated by a globe of the moon in my elementary school library. I remember presenting on the Apollo 11 moon landing in the 3rd grade. I wrote letters to NASA as soon as I could write, and the 4 walls of my childhood bedroom were covered for years with the posters that they sent. And a wall-sized poster of the Milky Way stayed there on my bedroom walls until I left for college a decade later. I wanted to be an astronaut, but since we couldn't afford to send me to space camp, I made my own at home. I distinctly remember spending an entire week one summer, standing on a chair, arms outstretched overhead, using a tennis racket, the sticky side up, of 1,000 glow-in-the-dark stars. And I put them on the ceiling to make my own personal planetarium in the actual constellations. I called it the Astrotarium. I was a space kid. How could I not be? There was a supernova in 1987, clearly visible in the sky. Halley's Comet came around for the first time in 76 years in 1986. And after it disappeared, the kids' telescopes went on sale, and my mother bought me one. Although I didn't get to use it very often, it became one of my prized possessions, and I brought it with me to my grandparents' house in the countryside. I remember my grandmother waking me up late one night at the farm and asking me to head outside with her so that we could angle the telescope up and look at the full moon overhead. I looked at the sights, I set the telescope up on the hood of her massive 1970s yellow Cadillac, and I focused it so that you could see the moon and the beauty of its craters just so. Grandma leaned over to look and bumped the telescope. I set it up again, and she couldn't see through the eyepiece. As many of you will sympathize, learning to look through a telescope or a microscope is a skill, and one that requires practice. And so in retrospect, it's not hard to understand why she was having a hard time. We tried again and again in the cool night air, but she never did get to see the moon through the telescope. I like to tell this story because it reminds me of the difficulties that we in STEM sometimes have in reaching out beyond our scientific worlds to share our passions with our families and with our communities. When Galileo wrote to his friend Kepler about the difficulties he was having in convincing people of his discoveries, that the moon had mountains and that Jupiter had moons, he complained that they wouldn't even bother to look through the telescope because they thought it was a trick of vision or that he was seeing optical illusions. Now, in my classes, I go into detail about the nature of optics and lens making to explain why some people at the time may have had reasons to doubt what Galileo was seeing. But poor Galileo was at his wit's end, and he didn't know how to deal with people who couldn't see the basic facts in front of them and who couldn't even be bothered to try to look through the telescope. "My dear Kepler," Galileo said, "shall we laugh or shall we cry?" I think there are perhaps lessons for us here in our contemporary moment. The challenges of space are also very real. I distinctly remember the Challenger explosion, also in 1986. We were all gathered in class to watch it, and then suddenly something happened, and the TV was turned off. Just this past summer, I discovered in my mother's basement a poem that I had written about it, next to an astronomical archive of my childhood, a clay Saturn, a moon, and a star that I had made, rockets cut out of shiny gold cardboard paper, and even a dot matrix printout that said, "Welcome to the Astrotarium." I couldn't think of any better decorations for my office here today. So sometimes childhood dreams really do come true. I began to think of myself as a writer as well as a scientist, and I began to keep voluminous files. There's one here at the back that's labeled NASA. I was always the super nerdy kid, designing my own Nintendo t-shirts or marble paper shoots hanging on the walls. But by that time in school, I was also incessantly bullied by a terrible little boy who called me a beaner and a wetback because my father was from Mexico. I knew it was supposed to make me feel ashamed about my family, like the way that I felt waiting in the cattle lines at the American Embassy in Mexico City with my father as he tried and failed and then finally succeeded in getting a visa for my great aunt and for my abuelita to come and visit us for medical care. Well, in my early years, I remember thinking how weird it was that some of my friends only spoke one language at home. As I grew older, I learned more about the world. I was proud of, but I also struggled with my identity. It seems foolish now, but for a long time I wished that I were named Bob, like the mailman, since no one could ever spell or pronounce Luis right. I was also a very American little kid whose first language was English. I could entender todo perfectamente, but I never felt as comfortable speaking Spanish as I wish I could have been. It took me a long time to learn that I was not alone in this. High school was a blur. Math homeroom, science fairs, and a subscription to Science News, a weekly newsletter of things that I really didn't understand, but I felt that I should. I had a great biology teacher and a great English teacher, both of whom became my mentors and who inspired me to work hard. I thought I might be a park ranger or a field naturalist or something like that. And thanks to my science teachers, my world began to broaden. And I began to think of science in action and how science relates to larger aspects of society. Around the start of my junior year, I told my mother that I thought I was going to go to college. And she said, "Oh, you do you?" as if there were any doubt. And when some months later I said I was going to apply to Harvard, everyone thought that was a bit much. My sister decided to tell the extended family at Thanksgiving, and everyone had a good long laugh. And the jokes continued until all the pumpkin pie was gone. I knew I couldn't do it on my own, and I went back to the library and I looked for scholarships that I could apply for. There was one from the Horace Mann Educators Corporation, an insurance company for the children of public school employees, and that fit me to a T. So I wrote an essay on the assigned theme of where I saw myself in 2027, addressing environmental issues in Dar es Salaam, and unbelievably, I won a $40,000 scholarship for this essay. Being able to pay for college seemed more possible. I applied for other federal scholarships as well, only to discover in one case that Congress decided to defund one of them at the last minute. I was so angry that I went to my local library, this was before the internet, I looked up the Secretary of Education and all of my representatives, and I promptly chewed them out. And so, without quite intending to, I began to realize in the course of my own life and to fight for the connections between scientific workforce development and federal policy. By the time I left Wisconsin for college on the East Coast, I felt like I was already heading far out of the solar system of my youth. One of my roommates in college was majoring in the history of science. I remember thinking, what the heck is that? And more importantly at the time, what are you going to do with that? And at least with biology, I could be a laboratory molecular biologist or a park ranger. I was still undecided. But I never envisioned that my path through the worlds of STEM would ultimately take me into history. I remember learning all about evolution and Darwinism, and I went to my grandparents' farm, eager to try to connect that book learning with the real-world practices of farming with my grandpa and my uncle. And I remember telling my grandma about some of the things that I was learning. When I mentioned Darwin, she said in a slightly concerned voice that I didn't have to believe everything that man said. But my mother supported whatever my interests were in science. She began sending me newspaper clippings about science stories from the local paper, and literally 20 years later, she's still sending them to me. These just arrived last month. I talked to her on the phone on the way over here, and she says she already has a few more she's getting ready to send me. I loved organic chemistry, but I hated lab. I memorized my amino acids in my molecular biology class, and a C+ on a philosophy paper taught me not to try to do homework while sitting outside on beautiful spring days. I had some big names as teachers, Stephen Jay Gould and E.O. Wilson, but the best thing I ever did was go to office hours of all the other professors who actually had time for me. I took a conservation biology course that got us out into the field, where we almost lost a student in the bog. But I also did more sedate things that were no less interesting. I took jobs for a couple of delightful retired professors, one a biochemist, John Edsall, and the other a historian of science, I.B. Cohen. For I.B. Cohen, I transcribed dictation for a book on the history of computer science, and I proofread his new translation of Newton's Principia from 1687, the foundational text for modern physics. I had an advisor who was a generous man, but who in the end wasn't a good fit for me. He just couldn't understand why I wanted to take more math when it was clear that my path was going in a different direction. I switched advisors to an older, quirky malacologist who studied invertebrates, but who was warm and welcoming to me, who always made time, and who connected with me as an individual. I found wonderful mentors and people whose lives were very different than mine, but who supported me. I was not alone. Although I graduated as a biology major, I began to take my electives in other disciplines that were about science, but were not themselves science classes. I definitely wasn't ready to call myself a historian, but I was diversifying my disciplinary education on my own terms. Here I am, for instance, in a chamber music class. I also continued to explore my career options. I tried working for a student-run travel guide company, and then I applied for a paid summer internship in the news department at Science Magazine, where I learned firsthand about science journalism and, because this is Washington, science policy. It turned out to be a great fit, and they let me write my first piece at the end of my time there, Building a Better Bug Repellent, which was published in 1998. It was a great job, but I learned that I didn't like the pressure of churning out copy every day by 5 p.m. And while it was very interesting to get invited to a press conference at the White House about algal blooms in the Chesapeake Bay, it was a little intimidating when the event was over and I couldn't find my way out. I somehow ended up in the basement floor of the West Wing. And after stopping to ask a nice-looking security guard for directions, I was, shall we say, promptly escorted out. In retrospect, I now see that what I was doing in college, by trying lots of different things, was that I was learning how to study science as a scientist, as a humanist, and as someone committed to public outreach all at the same time. And I kept on learning life skills, like you should really arrive on time for dinner at your boss's house, or everyone will have eaten their artichokes before you've arrived and you'll have no idea how to eat this thing. No one ever told me in STEM that to be in STEM I'd have to know how to eat artichokes. It was only after I graduated college that I made the first formal move since high school to leave biology behind a little bit and to focus instead on the history of biology. I won a fellowship to study for my master's in the history and philosophy of science at the University of Cambridge in England, where I discovered the history of heredity, which remains my intellectual specialty to this day. And I can trace that back to seeing a bright red book on the shelf and wondering, what's that? That's how it started. I wrote my thesis there on the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein and the sociology of scientific knowledge. I had an opportunity once, in about 20 seconds, to explain my research to Prince Charles when he came to visit our college at a special event. Everybody got about 20 seconds. He was very good at working the room. He listened carefully to my explanation, and then he said with a smile, and I'm not sure if there was any understanding there, but I salute you. I graduated from Cambridge in 2000. By the time I came back to the States to start my doctorate in the history of science, I was ready to study the history of biology full-time. Grad school was rough, as I think it is for lots of people, but I was not alone. I made some good friends I could count on and who could count on me, and with their help I learned how to read French and German. I found my way through my coursework and my general examinations, and I found my way into a good research project that eventually, decades later, turned into my first book. I was interested in the history of genetics, and I began to explore the connections between the early science of radioactivity, the origin of life, and early attempts to induce mutations in living things, the first generation of genetic engineering decades ago. That exploration of how experiment and metaphors have mutually influenced each other over the span of decades of work in the history of biology eventually became my dissertation. You can see how tired I am on the day I'm delivering it to the registrar. And years later, my book, Radium and the Secret of Life. Mentors and allies may not be quite what you expect. I'm convinced that my advisor, though a warm and friendly man, never actually read my dissertation. But that meant that it was up to me to take the initiative to build up a circle of mentors outside of my department and even outside my university, and that effort served me very well in the years to come. Your advisor may not be your mentor, and that's okay. You can trust a bit in serendipity in who you meet, and trust in your gut. Remember, you are not alone. Trust your microbiome. There are lots of good mentors out there, and you'll know them when you find them, but don't give up looking for them until you find them. Just like with exoplanets, some might be too cold and some too hot, but like Goldilocks, sometimes you'll find more than one that's just right, or maybe even almost too good to be true. And enjoy yourself. I certainly did. Because while distant solar systems might be light years away, graduation does finally arrive, rain or shine. And it was rain. In the end, I decided to become a professional historian of science after all, and that apparently meant that I had to buy a suit to begin interviewing for an academic job. It cost a lot of money, but I wore that suit almost every day for the next 6 years to amortize the cost. What I didn't realize at the time of my big interview with the big fancy school was that the price tag was still tucked in under the collar of my jacket during the interview. I didn't get that job. The job market is always incredibly difficult, but I did manage to land a job at another small school, and I was just thrilled at the age of 30 then to finally be receiving my first real paychecks as a professional. No more ramen noodles for me. It was a steep learning curve to become an effective teacher, but I loved sharing the thrill of my field with my students, and I felt like everything was on the up and up. But there were challenges as well. I quickly realized that being at a school with struggling finances meant a lot of general stress for a young faculty member, and also that I would have to fund most of my research out of my own pocket, which at least for historians is sometimes an option. And despite having some wonderful colleagues, I also encountered some horrible people. Sometimes they're your students, sometimes they're your colleagues, sometimes they're your bosses. Things don't always go according to plan. Sometimes a student breaks into the dean's office and tampers with course evaluations. Sometimes your data is stolen by a grad student working at the journal you submitted your article to. Sometimes your work is ignored and not cited when it should be by someone who cites everyone else instead. Sometimes a grievance has to be filed for unprofessional behavior from someone who should have been one of your supporters. Sometimes, and perhaps not coincidentally, you suddenly discover that you have a health condition that so impacts your life that it takes over everything else for a while. Sometimes your name is misspelled 3 times on the job contract before they get it right. Sometimes a new colleague welcomes you and says how nice it is to have a Mexican national on the faculty, and did I know how much she enjoyed speaking Spanish with her gardener. Your mileage may vary, but failures of character and circumstance abound, and being in STEM is a human experience like any other. But as Bart Simpson wrote on the chalkboard dozens of times, science class should not end in tragedy. Things will happen, but what matters most is how you deal with it. There is always a way through. I turned to my friends, my family, my mentors, and my community to help me through. I was not alone, and neither are you. It's a long road, and you have to enjoy your life at the same time. Try lots of different things and take advantage of your youth. You're only young once, as they say, and if you do it right, once is enough. Live in the ambiguity of not quite knowing what will come next. As the great poet Rilke once wrote, I want to beg you, as much as I can, to be patient towards all that is unresolved in your heart, and to try to love the questions themselves like locked rooms, or like books that are written in a very foreign language. Do not now seek the answers, which cannot be given you, because you would not be able to live them, he wrote. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. But if you haven't already come to terms with yourself, find a way to become your full self, whatever that means for you. For me, that meant coming out, finally, at the age of 25. And I discovered that I was not as alone as I had feared for so many years. And then, after learning more about myself and scanning the universe of possibilities, and after a decade of billions and billions of dates, I found him. Life got infinitely more meaningful, more interesting, and more fun. Once I received that signal and beamed one back, I ended up being able to concentrate even more and to do even better work in my field. I passed the hurdles of peer review, and I got my book published. I got tenure, and I found a way. Yes, I'm from New Mexico. And I found a way to balance my life with my work in a way that made both of them better. I was not alone. But we are not alone either. We live in a world that is larger than ourselves and our own personal lives. And so I want to offer a few words now in conclusion to help broaden out from this frame and to think about our current moment. We're living in what many have been calling the Anthropocene, a new epoch of human dominance over the global climate. I understand that of the 17 hottest years on record, 16 of them have occurred since I graduated from college. The cherry blossoms around the tidal basin began to flower in mid-February this year, weeks ahead of schedule. And in our society, every day brings further concern in the newspaper headlines. Science is not immune from current events. A few weeks ago, an Iranian-American science journalist at an annual science meeting reported that she was told by a fellow attendee to go back to her country. And just last week, of course, an Indian engineer was shot and killed after being told something similar. We love science for what it tells us about the world. It is one of the most glorious of human intellectual creations. But all of us who work in STEM are also inescapably part of a social and political reality, whether we like it or not. And so what that means is that science is always political, not partisan, mind you, but that like every human activity, it is embedded in a larger context. To say that science is political is simply another way to acknowledge, as historians do, that what we study in science always has something to do with, for instance, what's worth funding, or who is part of the team and what they contribute, or what's valued by larger society. There's no easy formula for this relationship between science and society. That's why we need history. We wouldn't have made advances in nuclear physics were it not for the Manhattan Project, which was itself a response, of course, to global politics. But complicating things further, we also know from the history of the last century that simply having more knowledge or more powerful devices is not necessarily an inherent good in itself if it's not channeled in productive ways for human betterment. So to understand that science has a political life does not just mean that everything is someone's opinion or that politicians can write about science. And we did just discover last week that Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote an essay about finding life in space, right? No, it means that for all the evidence we uncover and all the theories we work so hard to establish, the world in which science lives, its development, its funding, its place in society, is all part of the larger social worlds that we all live in. We're so used to assuming that science leads and society follows that we sometimes need to remind ourselves that it's a much more complicated dance than that. Facts matter, but so do narratives. Think back again to Galileo. When confronted with such difficulties in his own time, Galileo asked whether we should laugh or cry. This remains a perennial question. How shall we respond to the challenges that science faces in our world? Today, it seems a third response has emerged. We shall march. It's been many years, arguably, since the height of concern over nuclear weapons and the dangers of fallout from nuclear testing, since many scientists last felt the need to engage in direct political mass demonstrations. But we live in remarkable times. And on April 22nd, many of us in STEM, and joined by the AAAS and many other scientific organizations, will witness, not just with our brains and our voices, but with our bodies, that science matters. Now, not everyone can or should march, but science matters. Science has no party, and scientific facts don't win in discussions of public policy without political support. And so whatever your politics are, I would encourage you all to call or visit your representatives in Congress and stop by while you're here in town if you're still here for a few more days. Make yourself and your passion and your views known, and be an active part of our democracy. We in STEM must advocate in our democratic society not only for those priorities that we think are important, but also for scientists to be able to follow the truth wherever it leads, and for the freedom to express and publish and share what they learn. We must advocate for science to be better deployed in better ways for a better world. Because no matter at what stage in our careers we find ourselves in STEM, we are always called on to act as citizens, as scientists, as people, not only for what is true, but also for what is right. And so finally, I'd like to encourage you to make yourselves ready. Memorize your amino acids and perfect your pipetting. Learn your chi-squared tests and your p-values. Master your instrumentation and hone your observational skills. But diversify your education as well. Read broadly and learn to write and speak effectively. Become persuasive for the just causes of your choice, and always open the path wider to those who are coming behind you. Make yourself ready in every way, because no matter what area of STEM you find yourself in, you never know what you may need. Commit yourself to your interests and your passions, so that when that moment comes, this spring, or next year, or 10 years from now, or 20, and you get a desperate phone call from Flint, or Standing Rock, or a dam in California, or from the CDC, or the levees in New Orleans, or heck, the Planetary Protection Office, asking for your scientific expertise, that you'll be ready in all the many and unexpected ways that you can't even begin to imagine right now. Ready yourself to work with others who've prepared themselves in different or in complementary ways, so that you too can say to someone else, you are not alone. A life engaged in STEM in whatever fashion is one of the most fulfilling paths to a life that I can imagine. It is also a life completely full of wonder. Right? The natural and the social worlds are full of fascinating things to be understood and to be engaged with. Always take advantage of every opportunity that you can. I never would have imagined that someday I'd become a historian, that just 4 days ago I'd be discussing science policy at the White House, that I would hold the moon in one hand and Mars in the other. Who does that, right? Or that I would have the chance to address members of Congress or the National Academies of Science, or to be here with all of you tonight. There are many ways to be fully engaged with STEM, believe me, I've tried many of them, and the one that works for you is the right one. Our country and our world need you to be active in whichever one of those ways works best for you. And if you find at some point, whenever that might be, that something in your career plan isn't working out, don't be afraid to stop and to switch gears and to do something else. There's no shame in finding an alternative tack. I'll say that again, an alternative tack. Right, to find the best way to make yourself useful to the world. But usefulness is, of course, not the only goal of life. 100 years ago, the philosopher Henri Poincaré wrote, "The scientist does not study nature because it is useful, he studies it because he delights in it, and he delights in it because it is beautiful. If nature were not beautiful, it would not be worth knowing, and if nature were not worth knowing, life would not be worth living." The world is a remarkable place, my friends, and we are not alone. Thank you.